Good afternoon. We are welcoming people into this conversation this afternoon, and we will take just another minute to allow some additional people to come into the conversation, and then we will begin this afternoon's conversation. Appreciating and respecting the time of those who joined us this afternoon, why don't we get started? And I will open us up by introducing myself to those of you I've yet to have the pleasure of meeting. I'm Jennifer Jones Austin. I am blessed and privileged to serve as the CEO of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies here in New York City. I also serve as the chair of the New York City Racial Justice Commission, which has put forth 3 proposals that will appear on the ballot here in New York City this election cycle. And so we are here this afternoon to talk with faith leaders of institutions across the city of New York that play a critical role in essentially educating the generations present and future on faith and faith and service and pastoral leadership and just how people may show up in their respective faiths, but really centering on our faiths and our religions and how we live into them. They're here to talk with us about the racial justice proposals, but also about the larger question, the ever-looming question of faith and justice and what our respective faiths say about who we are as people of faith engaged in justice work or the lack thereof. So before I talk, just preview for you the racial justice proposals, and before we get into our discussion, I want to take a minute to make sure that you have an awareness, those who joined us, an awareness of the people who are on this Zoom and who will be presenting and dialoguing one with another today. So, I'm always so tempted when I look at the Zoom and I see the squares that are before me to think that the squares as I see them are the squares as other people see them. And I want to go from left to right, or I want to go up and down. And I have to remember that, how I see the world may not be different than the way others people see it. It may be different from how other people see it, right? So what I'm going to do is just go by, I think I'm going to go by alphabetical order, beginning with Reverend Dominique Atchison. Some of you may know her because she first came on the scene with me when she served as the head of the Community and Faith Partnership Department in the city of New York under Mayor Bill de Blasio. She now serves as the Director for Racial Justice Initiatives with the Interfaith Center of New York. Good afternoon, Reverend Atchison. Going in alphabetical order, I'm going to turn to Reverend Dr. Willie D. Francois III. He is the professor and director and master of professional studies at Sing Sing Correctional Facility for the New York Theological Seminary. And can I just take a minute to let's plug your book for a minute? The title of your book, Reverend Francois?
Silencing White Noise: 6 Practices for Overcoming Our Inaction on Race.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. I got to get my book, but I got to get it signed. So maybe I'll purchase it and then come and bring it to you. The next person who I'll introduce is Reverend Dr. Charles Galbraith, and he's the Associate Dean and Director of Field Education for Alliance Theological Seminary, which is now part of Alliance University. Good afternoon. The fourth person I'll bring forward is Reverend Dr. Emma Jordan Simpson. She's the president of the Auburn Seminary, has also served as executive pastor at Concord Baptist Church of Christ. And by way of full disclosure, she also is a board member of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. You saw that smile on my face growing and growing and growing. And then certainly not the least, just happened by alphabetical order to be the last, Rabbi Stephanie Ruske. And Rabbi Ruske is the executive director of the Hindle School for Ethics and Justice at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to have a conversation centering on justice and faith. And what has brought us all together for this conversation are the 3 ballot proposals that are before New Yorkers, and New Yorkers will have an opportunity to vote on them. Those who have registered to vote and are eligible to vote will have an opportunity to vote on them come this election season, which actually begins in a little more than a week. October 29th is the beginning of early voting here in New York City, and Election Day is November 8th. There are 3 proposals that center on racial justice and equity. I serve as the chair of the Racial Justice Commission and was a part of bringing these proposals to the New York City ballot. I'd like to say I played a big part in bringing them to the New York City community for voting. These proposals are aimed at advancing and promoting justice and equity in government functioning. The proposals came about in the, I guess what you would say, like the commission that brought forth the proposals was stood up in the wake of what some of us, I guess, would think of as a perfect storm, if you will. A perfect storm that revealed several crises here in America as well, and here in New York City. Crises that actually resulted in opportunity. The first crisis was the continuing racial discrimination that is experienced by persons of color disproportionately when it comes to excessive use of force in policing, when it comes to excessive policing. We saw with the killing of George Floyd and the killing of Breonna Taylor back in 2020, how racism persists in policing here in America. And we all remember that we took to the streets in the midst of COVID, essentially standing up and speaking out against injustice in policing. But while that was happening, it was all in the midst of COVID, a pandemic that was raging across the country. And the impact was disproportionately felt and experienced in Black and Brown communities. Why? Because in Black and Brown communities, it was hard to run from the disease. You couldn't really hide. In communities, Black and Brown communities, particularly communities of lower, where families have lower income, they weren't able to lock themselves behind closed doors and keep COVID out. They actually had to get out in the streets, get on the subways and the buses here in New York City. They were essential workers. They had to go out and make sure that for some people who had to keep working, that childcare was available. For families that needed home health assistance, they had to make sure that they were taking care of that. They are the domestic workers working in many families, the individuals who are cleaning up the hospitals, some of them nurses, but some of them just taking care, making sure that the rest of us could be safe and protected. They were the ones out in the grocery stores. They were the ones delivering our packages. Disproportionately Black and Brown people riding the subways that were overcrowded because they actually cut back on the subways and the buses to keep some people at home. These were the people who were experiencing COVID at the highest rates because their jobs, their family experiences caused them to be out there. And then sometimes they were coming home to families, to apartments where many people were residing. They couldn't spread out like some of us could spread out. They couldn't spread out. And then when you take that and you have that, the higher risks that attend with all of those circumstances, and you take a community that, communities, Black and Brown communities that have lacked in access to quality healthcare, accessible, affordable healthcare, quality healthcare in their communities, lack of access to healthy foods, fruits and vegetables that are, that aren't, excessive in terms of the cost, because essentially if you buy a banana in a Black and Brown community, there's a great likelihood you're paying more for it than if you're in an affluent community. It's as though they've got to bring it across the water and bring it in the community, ways of charging higher costs for just basic goods. So we had Black and Brown communities that, because of their circumstances, the inequities that have persisted in Black and Brown communities, that have been structural in nature, the deprivation of critical resources in Black and Brown communities, higher rates of death from COVID, sickness and death due to comorbidities, greater rates of asthma because of the pollutants in our communities, greater rates of obesity and diabetes because of lack of access to quality food. The list can go on and on and on. We saw a perfect storm. We saw the killings, We saw some vigilantism, right? Some white people down in Georgia thinking, they could just gun down a Black man. That raised our awareness about how pervasive and extensive still is, the over surveillance and policing of Black and brown people. And then we had COVID. So these two storms came together in the midst of yet a political crisis, having us all wonder, where are we as a society? What do we believe? What do we value? The surge of, like centering on critical race theory and how this has all come to be. And then replacement theory coming behind it, trying to dismiss what is legitimate critical race theory. Well, here in New York, we are fortunate that at the time, our then mayor, Bill de Blasio, and we're not going to get into any politics associated with him in this moment, but we are fortunate that he appreciated, with respect to all that was happening, that we could not pretend that racism was just possibly in policing, but rather we had to embrace that racism pervades every pillar of our society. I didn't even touch upon education and what was happening with our children during COVID, Black and brown children. But Bill de Blasio saw that we could not let this moment pass, that racism extends far and beyond policing in America. Racism pervades every pillar of our society. And he seemed to also appreciate that you can't program your way out of racism. You can't just policy make your way out of racism, because whatever programs and policies you're building on a system and a structure that is inherently racist, they're not going to hold up if the foundation is flawed. And we know that it is, beginning with, the creation of this nation, the taking of the land of Lenape people, enslaving Black persons and making it legal, and all the laws that have flowed therefrom. Racism is structural in nature. So Mayor Bill de Blasio brought together a commission comprised of 11 people, New Yorkers hailing from every borough, representing people of the Asian community, the African American or the African community, people of African descent, and people of Hispanic origin, to come together and to look at our charter, the New York City Constitution, to begin to identify ways of dismantling structural racism. The commission met with New Yorkers all across New York City, in all of the boroughs, in the communities where racism, where we see the impact of racism the greatest. And we met with subject matters and thought leaders from across the country. And ultimately, we voted out 3 proposals. We heard a lot about the inequities in the areas that I've mentioned. I don't need to list them again. We realized that if we tried to address each and every one, line by line with the charter, we'd actually be trying to put forth at least 300 proposals to address structural racism. We realized New Yorkers would not vote for 300 proposals, would stop reading probably after the second. And so we found a way to essentially develop some, overarching proposals that would begin to reset the foundation, a flawed foundation. Very quickly, the first proposal creates a preamble for the city of New York. New York City does not have a vision for what it is and what it should be, or at least an articulated vision. The commission felt strongly that if you do not know what you're driving towards, if you don't have an aspirational vision to be your guide for policy making, for programming, then you're just out there kind of wilding and you just kind of make it up as you go. We needed a preamble to set the vision, a preamble that, if voted upon by the majority of New Yorkers, will say, we believe as New Yorkers that we are a multiracial democracy where everybody, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or identity, has a right to a quality education, a quality healthcare system that is accessible within their neighborhoods, has a right to affordable and safe housing, fair and living wages, has a right to environmental protections that help us to, not be burdened with asthma and other environmentally related concerns and diseases. This preamble is intended to set forth a value base that New York, the city of New York, then lives into. And if it should pass, it says to the city of New York, we New Yorkers desire equity, for all persons, regardless of their income, how they live or who they love, their identities. This is what we believe. The second proposal would establish an Office of Racial Equity, along with a racial equity plan and a requirement that a commission be stood up in perpetuity to hold the city of New York accountable for implementing racial equity. The racial equity plan would require that every city agency, every mayoral office, look at a key set of data and indicators that helps us to identify where the inequities, the racial equities, and all the intersectional issues exist and persist, and then to come up with a plan to address those inequities and not just bring communities and people up by a notch or two, but bring them up to where we see, most affluent, white neighborhoods, not just surviving, but thriving. And the commission would be that checks and balances holding the city accountable for implementing it. There would also be a report issued in the off years. The plan would be produced every 2 years, a report in the off years, so that all New Yorkers can lean in and see what this government is doing. Because here, if they've got a preamble that says this is what we believe, now we got to hold the city of New York accountable to it. The third proposal, the final proposal, would establish here in New York a true cost of living measurement. It would require the city of New York to calculate annually what it truly costs to live here. Now, why is that important? Because we know that in this nation, all across this nation, that wages and critical income supports are set and influenced off of an outdated, antiquated federal poverty measure, which says that a family for living anywhere in America needs just $27,750 to not be poor. That helps to justify for a family with 2 adults a federal minimum wage of $7.25, because when annualized and doubled, that's $30,000. So if you have 2 adults and 2 children in a household, and they're bringing in the federal minimum wage of $30,000, look, if the federal poverty level says that $27,750 cuts it, $30,000, they're not poor. And then that poverty level is used to set eligibility for food stamps, food supports, for childcare subsidies, housing subsidies, transportation subsidies, eligibility for Medicaid, eligibility for the Affordable Care Act subsidy. If you make that a very low level, now you're possibly cutting off people who can't make ends meet. That is economic deprivation that is willful, intentional, and structural. And while everybody is affected by it, because there are white people who are poor as well, Black and brown persons are disproportionately affected because they are disproportionately in lower wage jobs, and because we know that Black and brown persons, and in particular Black and brown women, are paid significantly less than white men and white women for the same jobs. This is structural racism. So the 3 proposals are intended to advance and promote racial justice and equity, setting a vision, ensuring accountability, and then leaning in and beginning to get to work at one of the core fundamental structural laws that upholds economic deprivation, wage deprivation, and critical supports to help people not only survive, but thrive. Okay, panel, you're aware of these proposals. One of the things that the commission has felt very strongly about is the importance of engaging with the faith community to help raise awareness about these proposals. It is very much believed that the faith community are trusted sources. And so, when you have in communities, and especially communities of color, people who feel apathetic about voting, people who feel disconnected from this democracy, or ignored, disadvantaged, purposefully left behind, they don't want to engage. The question that I have for you, both related to the proposals and then extending beyond, from a theological perspective, is there a role of faith in centering on efforts aimed at bringing about justice here in America? And so I'm opening it up maybe I'll begin. Let's see. It looks like Reverend Francois is very contemplative in thought. So I'll begin with you. Do you believe that, from a theological vantage point, that our faith communities have a role to play in bringing about justice?
Thank you so much, Attorney Jones Austin, for your work in advancing these proposals and getting us to this point where the people get to make a decision on the moral health and the political accountability of our city related to racial justice. And I think it is apropos to state that you are not just a person of faith, but you are a leader of faith, one who I think is a faith leader, however we want to define that. And so the fact that you have been very integral in these conversations and pushing us to this point is in alignment with how I understand the role of faith communities in the public square. What we've seen over and over again from city to city to state policy and even to federal policy, that faith communities who are interested in human flourishing and interested in questions of equity, faith communities have been a strong force for justice and making America live up, and our cities live up to the print version of ourselves. I think that is important to name because on paper it is always interesting that America looks better than it actually does in public. And it has been faith communities that have done the work, and even in places like our city, where your father and others have been a part of the conscience of the city, the gadflies, the spooks at the door, who refuse to allow bodies to be ravished by policies that are interested in upholding the interests of the few, the interests of those who have intentionally hoarded power and who have intentionally hoarded opportunity and concentrated poverty and powerlessness in other places. And so it is my opinion that faith communities, all faith communities, have in their DNA a commitment to ideals and ideas of justice as articles of faith. That we don't do this work as recreation. We don't do this work as one-off commitments. But in each faith tradition, you can see a history and a legacy of contributing to protecting the least, or to say protecting those who are most vulnerable and most unprotected in our societies. It is, as someone who speaks as a follower of Jesus, one who speaks as a follower of Jesus, who does not speak the way the most loud voices of followers of Jesus speak, one who speaks from a brush harbor tradition and not a plantation tradition of Christianity. I understand that there is deep significance in why Jesus starts his ministry in a Nazareth synagogue, talking about the Spirit of the Lord, a kind of spiritual experience that compels him to speak good news to the poor. That's anti-poverty legislation. To talk about recovery of sight to the blind. That sounds like affordable healthcare to me. To talk about setting the captive free, ending mass incarceration and police brutality, and the recovery, and also the acceptable year of the Lord, which I interpret to be the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, when slaves are released, debt is forgiven, and the land is given a break. That sounds like abolition and reparation to me. As somebody who's a Christian, I understand that this is the work that faith communities are committed to.
Well, so well said, so on point. It looks like Reverend Jordan Simpson, Dr. Jordan Simpson, is coming in.
I'm just trying to contain myself over here. Is that Dr. Willie Francois, something else? The question I'm asking that I think we can, when we pose to all of our faith traditions, is it the will of the divine however we consider the divine, is it the will of the divine that our economies, that our society be structured to deliver injustice? Because, and so grounded in my own tradition, Christianity, the origin stories matter to me, right? And I'm thinking about, the great, the creation story. And after every act, the evaluation was, it was good. It was good. Not, it was unjust. And I'm okay with that, right? But that it wasn't, that it was good. But then when I also think about, this is we live in a context, not in a vacuum. And this is a multi-faith environment. And so when I think about, our neighbors, folks in the Baha'i community, who say they say they understand it as the light of people is justice, they say, and quench it not with the contrary winds of oppression and tyranny, because the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity. And in Buddhism, where there are nuances of the understanding even of Dharma, right, where it in itself means justice. And in the sense of a belief that all people possess intrinsic value and that all are endowed with inherent dignity. And so for us to be complacent about structures that do not protect dignity is going against, what we say that we believe. What I am appreciative of is that this effort is not about trying to create a theocracy or to say, that we're oppressing folks with our religious traditions and thoughts and beliefs, and maybe the United States of America can take a page from that, and because we're not trying to create a theocracy in this city, but there are common good values, right? There are common good values that people of faith and people who are agnostic or atheist agree with, that people should be treated with dignity and respect, and that we should honor their potential. And so I'm incredibly excited about this, but I also believe, going back to what I said about us not being living in a vacuum, we've already engaged the question of theology and justice at the very foundation, the start of this country, right? We put the name of Jesus on those ships that brought enslaved people over as cargo. We used the doctrine of discovery to try to erase indigenous people. We were making theological proclamations in all of those actions. But there is a good use for theology. And for me, it turns on that question. Is it the will of the divine that we structure our society for people to experience injustice? I think I know the answer to that. So
I'm reminded in this moment, and you may recall it, and I may not get it 100% right, but a statement that my father, Dr. William Augustus Jones, wrote in his work, God in the Ghetto, where he says that the racist ascribes to God a partiality on the basis of pigmentation, and then assigns people their permanent places under the sun on the basis of their pigmentation. And so it's essentially, the racist is saying that God is racist and justifying, how the society has been ordered, because God himself, God herself has decided, certain people based on the color of their skin should be seen as lesser than. And I'm also reminded I have an uncle, former he's now deceased, William Jones, who wrote the book titled Is God a Racist? Because that's the way they've set it up. Dr. Ruskay, Rabbi Ruskay, Reverend Atchison, Dr. Galbraith, do you want to weigh in on this? Any thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I'll go. I mean, I would say Jewish tradition talks a lot about seeing everybody as made in the image of God. So I feel like if that's your orientation to the world, then how could you even imagine a society that was structurally unjust? So we don't always act like that, but that is sort of one of the underlying principles of faith. And we have lots of laws that require us to give charity, no matter how poor or rich you are. We think about the dignity of other people as important as our own. Like that is a religious way to see the world. So I think I feel like seeing everyone as made in the image of God just sort of means that like that's how you vote, that's how you think about the world, that's how you do your job. That is the lens through which we operate. But we also have, a master story of having been enslaved and being freed and being partners with God in sort of ending injustice in the world. So, and we read that story all the time. So I was sort of thinking about that with regard to the preamble and the charter. It's like when you put something in your founding document and you keep reading it, it has an impact on who you think you are in the world. And then you have to look at your actions and say, do they match the master story that we tell about ourselves? The other thing that I was thinking about is we recently now have in the US government a special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. And that's like a choice to have somebody's job be to monitor, racism. And I think people feel like that's an important thing. And if we think that's an important thing for the national government, it seems like you have to think about what does it mean to have a person in the role in the city or in a staffed office thinking about equity, thinking about racial justice. So I have found the opportunity to consider the preamble and the charter and the ballot proposals as an interesting reflection on faith and like how if we believe what we say we believe, then how do we act in the world? And the importance of putting that into a document that we all share as New Yorkers feels pretty important. So thank you for inviting me into this conversation.
Absolutely. We're going to move on to the next question, but if Dr. Galbraith or Reverend Atchison, if you'd like to jump in with a word or two, please feel free.
I'll try to be fast, but I think that I have three kind of categories on this. So there's like, and of course my foster daughter wakes up as I'm speaking. Of course, you're okay. Come back to me later.
Oh, good. Dr. Galbraith.
Yeah, if I could jump in, thank you, our faith leader, Jennifer Joan Austin, for leading this conversation, but so many other conversations, and to my other colleagues. Listen, y'all been preaching, y'all got it. I just wanted to lift up and reflect as educated in faith. I think it's important because, believe it or not, I still get conversations and interactions with individuals in different places concerning why are we concerned with this? What is the need for us to address this? And so I think before we educate, we must unlearn some things that have been translated through colonialistic perspective theologically, and with the history and many of our faith traditions have to be unlearned for us to first, again, learn what the text of our respective faith traditions is speaking from a Christian tradition, to understand and know all throughout the text of Scripture. I cannot, as a religious educator, look at it and not consider the challenge of justice. And we have within my tradition sometimes those who like to bifurcate out righteousness, personal piety, and justice, which is taking place in the public square. But that is antithetical to the whole counsel of Scripture that we find. We find that there is always an intersection concerning our righteousness and justice, and even in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the New Testament. The New Testament, the word that's used in the Greek is the same word for righteousness and justice. So they are always interconnected, always interlinked. And I believe that it is, as your father once said, our sociology that has corrupted some of our theology. And so we have allowed ourselves to be influenced by the systems and structures of oppression historically that have caused us to have a myopic view of our theology. And so for those in my tradition who come to me and say, why are we involved with justice? Why are we concerned about racial inequity? My response to them is that your understanding of the gospel is too limited. For to understand the fullness of the eugelion, the making good known, is the understanding that justice, righteousness are the critical components, as Dr. Francois lifted up, concerning even those of us who are Christian, our leader, our guide concerning this in Luke the 4th chapter, but in all through Matthew the 25th chapter, to say when we don't do this, we are called to account concerning when we do not embody and engage with those who are on the margins, and not just engage, but also advocate deeply and fulsomely concerning them. Then we are doing a disjustice and some things that we must unlearn to be able to move forward.
You know, I want to build on something you said. I want to just engage. You lifted up Matthew 25, the least of these, right? What I find sometimes happening is you take those Bible verses, that parable, and then you look at Jesus having said, the poor you will always have with you. And I believe that in certain circles that the faith communities has interpreted that to mean that Jesus was saying, all you gotta do is clothe those who are unclothed, visit those who are incarcerated, feed those who are going without, who are hungry. All you have to do is just manage poverty, because the poor you will always have with you. And so this watered down theology as to what is the calling, what is the responsibility. And I appreciated what Rabbi Ruske was saying about centering on charity. I heard a priest at Union Theological Seminary a little better than a year ago ask the question, if we are doing charity work only, is that to sin against God? Is charity work enough? And when I heard that, I thought about all of the faith institutions throughout the country, running food pantries, soup kitchens, doing clothing drives, coat drives at wintertime. Are they managing poverty? Are they working towards the eradication of poverty? Is running a food pantry justice work, as the Old Testament and the New Testament speak to? Or should there be more? What does faith, theologically rooted faith in justice actually look like? What does that look like in action? And Reverend Atchison, you're there with your little sweetheart, but I know that you've been working with faith community around the city, with the Interfaith Center, as well as when you were at the City of New York. How would you respond to that based on what you've seen and what your theology tells you?
So I actually want to move backwards on my resume and go back to when I was doing racial justice work with the United Church of Christ, and which is a predominantly white but very progressive denomination. And I worked mostly in upstate New York, and it's going to pertain to this, to to New York City because they would ask me, where am I from? And I would say, I'm from the Bronx. And they would inevitably, mostly white people, older white people would say, oh, I'm from the Bronx, or, oh, my mother's from the Bronx, or my grandparents are from the Bronx. And then they would inevitably ask the question also, not realizing that it was connected. If we are white and in an all white setting, a church setting, why do we have to talk about race? Because there's no one of color coming. Not realizing the fact that I'm from the Bronx and their parents are from the Bronx actually is about very intentional racial injustice that happened in the city of New York, very intentional incentives for white flight to upstate New York or out into the suburbs. And that leaving people of Black and brown people in the Bronx as the Bronx was burning. There was intentionality around that. So if you're in a church and you're all white, it's sort of like, we can talk about what the Bible, what sacred text has to say. We can talk about, what theologies have come up in response to injustice, but there's a very practical cultural thing where your church is located, where your house of worship is located, how many resources your house of worship has, how many people of color are around you. It makes a difference in the culture. And then to go deeper and further away from New York City, when all of the kind of cultural upheaval happened before George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, with Trump, all of the kind of white supremacy that was unearthed, it was very based in this notion of America being a Christian nation, which was a euphemism for white or white supremacy. So if you as a person of faith can't talk about that, then you're missing some language to be able to speak to those who are kind of perpetuating white supremacy in lots of corners of our world and our country.
Indeed. Others thoughts on this?
I'll hop in. Unfortunately, as people who live under the structural threat and on the underside of an organized conspiracy to keep us poor, to keep us trapped in caste-like locations. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of deciding whether or not to do charity because people are suffering now. But it's always important to know that as we do charity, that we're only treating the symptoms of something structural. What justice allows us to do is to attack in nonviolent, love-centered ways, those things that make charity necessary in the first place. That we don't we understand that it is not our luxury to only give out food, but we have to raise questions on why hunger exists in the first place. And then with a nonviolent, direct, action-oriented approach, attack those things that make hunger necessary in the first place. But we know, and this is one thing I've loved about faith communities is the dexterity to do both. To do justice and to do direct service, to do a charity work, understanding that charity is only meeting a very immediate need that has to be met because people are in housing insecure now. People are living under healthcare apartheid now. People are living with contaminated water in schools in our city now. right? So we know there are things we have to do now, but as we do those things, we don't forsake the structural vision and imagination to understand that there is something far more insidious, something far more massive and structural that must also be engaged. This is what I love about what it means to be a person of faith, is that we treat, as to use the words of Aubrey Hendricks, we treat the needs of people as holy. And in treating the needs of people as holy, we understand the fierce urgency of the moment, but we also possess a radical, tenacious imagination that believes a world that we've never seen before is possible, that a world without prisons is possible, a world without poverty is possible, a world without racism and patriarchy and sexism and homophobia is possible, a world free of the systems that were backed by policy and upheld by policy can actually be abolished. So yeah, that's my response to you, attorney.
So then, what would you say as faith leaders? What does it look like from the faith institution perspective, the faith leaders perspective, to be about? And let's just say it's about charity and justice, not just charity, not just justice. And Rabbi Ruske, I'm gonna get hold of the piece that you just put in the chat. When charity chokes justice, I've got to lean in and read that. Very much appreciate your sharing that reference piece. But what does it then look like for the faith community? Does it mean that you are like actively speaking out in the squares and circles that be on the injustice issues? Speaking to you, as you said, Reverend Francois, about why we need soup kitchens and food pantries in the first place. What does it look like? I've got my own vision of what it looks like. And I'll tell you, a lot of my vision, as you all can well appreciate, is informed by what I saw as a child and youth. I saw, I'm just going to put it to you very plainly. I saw my father leading a church where the church had a childcare and subsidized childcare for better than 100 children in the community, but didn't take a government grant to do it. Figured out how to subsidize it with the dollars of the church, very much believing that when you begin to take government money, you then can't speak out against the government on the injustices that persist. His whole take was, when you take, how did he say it? He said, when you sit at Caesar's table and you eat Caesar's meat, you then can't challenge Caesar. So for him, it looked like running the programs out of the church and turning to the community to help raise the funds to subsidize critical supports, after-school programs, childcare programs, programs for people suffering with substance abuse, and then being able to then go up against government and challenge the structures. So that's my orientation. And that's in part, I guess, maybe why I'm at FPWA, an organization that really only takes government funds when the government comes to us and says, we need you to help us get vaccines to the community, or we need you to help us raise awareness about the census. But we're not taking money to run our programs.
Yeah. Go ahead,
I'm
Dr.
just talking.
Well, I wanted to speak into that. Thank you for that reflection. For me and for the framing of what does this look like, I believe that it is that dexterity that Dr. Francois lifted up of like Albany and the avenues, right? City Hall and the streets, whereas not only as a seminary educator, but also as a pastor, we recognize the reality of our people who are experiencing the challenges of life. And to be honest with you, particularly even during the pandemic, you just get tired, right, of seeing the pain, the tears, the hurt, the need that is present, and you begin to ask the question, why? right? You begin to ask the question, what are the structures, what are the systems, what are the policies that are perpetuating the challenges that are present? And then as a result of what has been taking place within our streets, being deeply connected to those, to be able to have that prophetic voice that criticizes what is broken, to offer a critique concerning what is fractured, but then also, as others have said, to also yet still have a re-energizing voice to paint a picture of what can be. But I think that there is that deep connection between the deep experience of people that causes us to gain our voices concerning what is taking place. As one writer talked about how many of our congregations, when we're supposed to have a booming voice that speaks out for those who cannot speak to themselves, the congregations have caught laryngitis. And so the request is to say, can we get our voice back? Where is our voice to be able to advocate and to push towards these areas?
Can I just jump in and say, from my vantage point at Auburn Seminary, we did this project looking out across the country to see how faith communities were coming together to create these alternative, what I would call alternative economies. But basically, I think that they were also answering the question that you raised, Jennifer, and saying, no, we won't have the poor always with us, that is really our challenge. But there are communities all across this country that, they're coming together to create these alternative economies. They are Muslim and Christian and, they're and Jewish and folks who are, of no specific, religious tradition or, folks of deep moral convictions. They're putting together like care-based infrastructures. They're doing rematriation, like turning, the land back to indigenous peoples, back to the communities. They're creating these networks and ecosystems, beyond faith. But what they're doing in all of these places is saying that if this is to be different, then that means that we need to show up differently. And we need to answer that question, who is our neighbor, differently as well. I think that sometimes we just need to see that it's possible. Because this other thing about imagination, like being able to imagine a just society, a just city, right. And people are exhausted and their imagination muscles are very weak. And sometimes they just need to see that there are other places and other people who are doing who are making the impossible very possible. And that might also be a call that we engage in what as well, and just showing us that this is not impossible. Right. It is not the intractable will of God for this to be our destiny.
We are, we've got about another 5 minutes before we'll bring this session to an end, although I feel like we should have a part 2, a part 3, and a part 4, part 5, because we're only beginning to scratch the surface. I'm gonna ask you all to just, reflect on reflect on what Reverend Dr. Jordan Simpson just said, centering on that imagination piece for a moment. One of the things that we found fascinating when we were working on the commission, when the commission was working on the proposals, and hearing from people around the city, and then hearing from people who were considered subject matter experts on race and education, race and healthcare, race and the environment, and so on and so on. What we heard consistently were ideas about how to kind of in the moment deal with the problem, with the program, or with the policy. And I began to feel that people had lost the ability to imagine something more than what was, to envision something greater than what presently is. When I kept hearing people talk about a specific policy, even though we were talking to them about structural, like law change, foundational change, they kept responding with a new policy or new program. So I'm going to ask each of you, Maybe inspired by the proposals, or just thinking overall, like when you think about what a just and equitable society would look like, just tell me, like, throw out a few words about what that vision is or what it should be. Imagine something more that is. And Rabbi Ruscate, like, how do you see it? What do you think?
Well, I think it's real. I think it's multiracial, multi-faith, and relational. Like, I think that we live in a pretty segregated time in the city. And when you don't know each other, you don't feel called to care so deeply about somebody else's situation because you're so wrapped up in your own. But when you know each other, your problems become each other's. So in some ways, I think the most radical thing that religious institutions could be doing right now is seeing partnership and relationship with other faith communities and other civic communities, like, as a primary thing they have to do.
I like that. Reverend Atchison?
And unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump after I answer this question, but I think what pertains to the work that I did with the mayor's office, with the Center for Faith and Community Partnerships, is that I saw almost like, a prophetic vision of the world when working with the faith community in New York City, because it is the way that faith leaders work together across lines of faith tradition and belief systems to bring about justice in New York is so powerful. And so there is this way that if you're looking from that perspective, New York is closer to this vision than we think. But I think
we'll have to talk more about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it, if you think about a lot of the movements towards justice in New York City, they have been spearheaded by these really powerful interfaith groups. And that, I was just talking to my colleague about how you just sort of become a family of interfaith leaders that work together. And it's powerful. But I think in terms of New York City in general, what I want to see and what I actually asked Mayor de Blasio for is for some sort of, and I'm going to use religious language, but some sort of repentance on the part of the city for the intentionality behind the ways that segregation really hurt and killed people of color, especially from the 70s on. And I think some of the kind of jaded ways that we think, or the ways that we don't think it's possible that, because one of the questions for this panel is like, can you imagine a city that's just? And I'm like, no, I was born in 1980 in the South Bronx. So no, I can't imagine it, because there's so much injustice that's just been on my head my whole life. But I think some of the jadedness is because it's almost like a gaslighting of simultaneously weighting people down with intentional injustice and then saying New York is one of the most diverse places in the world and we're so great.
Right. Which is why I can't say that I can't tell people how to vote, but this is why we have to figure out how to embed equity and justice in the laws, in my opinion.
Yes, and I can't tell people how to vote either, but yes, I agree. Thank you all. Sorry, I have to go.
We're just going to hold people for another 2 to 3 minutes, if that's all right, because I want to make sure I hear from you all, and then we're going to close it out. Reverend Francois.
Yeah, I think that, and thank you for this time together. When I think about the kind of world that I want to see, I believe it starts with repair. It is not a jump to reconciliation. It is not an abstract oneness, but it is really all of us pooling our resources and flexing our moral muscles in ways that are committed to repair. There are a lot of harms that have been done by the city, in the name of the city, in the city. And it is possible, if it is possible to legislate structural harm, it is possible to legislate structural love. It is possible to legislate in ways that focus on the communities that have been most traumatized and most terrorized by power in our city. So as we talk about repair, there is a New York City that is possible that does not feed 75% of the state's prisons, right? There is a New York City that is possible where we do not have police officers who are allowed to go unaccountable. There is a New York City that is possible where everyone can actually afford to live in it. And those of us who live on Malcolm X are not being forced out of Malcolm X in Harlem because of a privileging of people who work on Wall Street, right? That New York City is possible because there's something endemic in what it means to be human that is good. I believe that humans are inherently good. And the ways that we allow that goodness to show up in our economic arrangements, to show up in our legal system, to show up in our policing, to show up in the ways that we legislate, I believe that that's possible because I believe in human beings. It's not about believing in cities. It's not about believing in government structures. Simply, I actually believe in people. And so repair is possible because people are good.
I like that. Reverend Galbraith?
Thank you. And thank you for coalescing and convening us for this. I appreciate the framing of this as imagination because that it's distinctive from fantasy, right? Because there is the possibility that this can actually be actualized. I want to go forward in just my concluding comments. Our faith leader, Jennifer Jones Austin, you said earlier about this reflection concerning the poor will always be with you. And as I reflect on that, Jesus is quoting from the Deuteronomy passage where he's saying, yes, the poor will always be with you, but you are called to be open-handed to those who are poor and needy. And so we recognize a problem that is present, but yet the possibility of those who are facing the problem to be engaged. And then you have to help me, excuse me, but my preacher mind goes all the way to the book of Acts where it talks about, and there were no needy among them. And so the reality that as we are reflecting on these situations and issues of racial inequity and injustice, that imagination is not a fantasy that we are disconnected from to say, oh, in the good by and by, it's an eschatological understanding of one day, somewhere in the by and by it can take place. But an actualized working in and working through that we are called to response and responsibility concerning to work for and can actualize. And so my hope and joy in the midst of this, that as the commission is putting together these questions and we're having these conversations and moving the meter forward, that we are actually engaging in the process of actualizing the imagination that has been set before us. And so it's not just winsome fantasy that we are simply engaging in, but rather an actualized understanding of this is what it can be. And we can be participants within that framework.
I love it. And in that spirit, helping bring to the faith communities these ballot measures and sharing with them to educate and inform them so that they can then take action as they so choose. But to distance yourself from them is to not be in the work of actualizing the faith. All right, we're going to have Reverend Dr. Emma Jordan Simpson, who helped bring us all together, take us on out. That sounds kind of like churchy, right? Going back, Reverend Dr. Emma Jordan Simpson.
I just want to hold
up the
up
benediction.
I just want to hold up the word sufficiency, because I believe that we have absolutely everything that we need. And it really is about how we use the resources that we have. We are, this is an amazing city, brilliant people all over the city. The solutions to our problems, our challenges, like all of that, we have those solutions in our people. We have what we need. We also have the resources that we need. We can't be a city where we have a $200 million apartment at the same time that we have 70,000 people unhoused. It has to be, we have to hold this value of sufficiency so that we can respect the dignity of us all. We have absolutely everything that we need in the city.
And the scripture tells us that, right?
Amen.
The scripture tells us this. This has been tremendous. Very quickly, there was someone who put a question asking whether seminaries that have recently begun creating space for discourse about justice issues are merely following the trend, or are these institutions moving towards something more lasting? For example, like requiring theologically based justice courses for MDiv and MA students. Very quickly, anybody have an opinion on that, given that you all are associated with seminaries? Is this just of the moment? Is this just a Black Lives Matter hashtag?
I don't think that it's just of the moment. I think that these concerns, quite frankly, have ebbed and flowed. I think that there is such a thing as a social gospel, or folks were trying to get at the issues of justice, but I think that this is a very different world right now, and our leaders need to be equipped to handle real soul issues, and justice is a soul issue. Hunger is a soul issue, and I think seminaries are very smart to try to prepare people to lead.
Well, I'm going to tell you all, I very much enjoyed this conversation, and I was not joking or just being flippant when I said I could have another part 2, or part 3, or part 4, or part 5 from you, because I'm learning from all of you, and you all are just making me want to get back into class and sit at your feet and learn. So perhaps there'll be opportunity for that as well. I thank you all for giving us this time. I'm glad that those who were able to join did lean in, and I know that they received a great word from the 5 of you as well. This recording will be available, and should you choose to share it with your respective communities, we will make sure that it's available to all of you. Thank you for a just time well spent, a great afternoon, and if I had many more hours in the day, I'd choose to spend them with you all. Have a good afternoon, and thank you all. Have a good evening.